Here from Ashoka, welcoming you to our Ashoka Life session today with Yeshimabeit Milner. Hey, Yeshi.
Hey, everybody.
Hi there. It's so good to have you here. We're going to give it a couple of seconds, everyone, because Zoom is just letting participants in. So we'll be starting in like a minute. Thank you for joining us today from wherever it is you are. And I see people still joining. So good. All right, let's give it a soft start here. Welcome everyone, and thank you for listening in again. My name is Konstanze Frischen. I am from Ashoka, here Ashoka's leader in North America. And my guest today is Ashoka Fellow Yeshimabeit Milner. Did I pronounce this correctly, Yeshi?
Yeshimabeit, the Irish.
Yeshimabeit Milner. When we always use Yeshi, I forget to pronounce your full name. So you're the co-founder and the executive director of Data for Black Lives. You are a data expert, a thought leader, an organizer, an activist, a change maker, all of these things. And we're going to explore that today. And I'm grateful to have you here amidst all the craziness. Thank you for dedicating us these minutes today.
Of course.
And we'll be talking about data, about unconscious bias, about racism embedded in structures. And the interesting thing here is that we're going to be talking about things that we cannot really see, but that are everywhere. They're everywhere in our lives. And other than one might commonly think when hears the word data, they're not neutral or objective. Because, and I think that's so powerful, what I learned through your work is data is harvested in context, right? It is shaped by history. It is shaped by who is in power, by the lens of the people who collect it and interpret it, define it. So I think an underlying theme is that the world is not as it seems at first view. There are layers of complexity and things that we are not seeing, but that doesn't make them less real. And we want to talk about that. And before we go there, we want to also talk about something personal here in the spirit of transparency and public acknowledgement. We want to talk about our unconscious bias. And when I say our, I mean Ashoka right now, that played itself out at a moment where we failed you, Yeshi. And I told you before, for that we are sorry, and we want to publicly acknowledge this here, and we want to explain it a little bit to our audience. So before I hand over to you in a second to shed light at it from your perspective. So what happened, everyone here on the phone, is around 5 years ago, we had examined our own data, and we saw that our fellowship was skewing heavily white. So we started diversifying our network. We're proud that now the majority of fellows we elect or have been electing over the last 5 years, a majority Black, Indigenous, people of color. And so it's an effort we were proud of, and we are going to continue. But, it doesn't stop there. And that, we really felt around this incident a year ago. What we do is we bring all our newly elected fellows to a new fellow gathering, and where we come together for a few days to connect, to relax, to strategize. And it's almost a year ago today that we hosted this gathering, yes, in Georgia. Yeshi was one of our new fellows. So we spent time in Atlanta, visiting the National Center for Civil and Human Rights. And then we moved to a venue outside of the city, which was a wellness place, with farm to table food, walking path, access to nature, or so we thought. But Yeshi, it was not as lovely as it sounds, right?
Yeah. First, I want to say thank you for acknowledging what happened. And I think in the spirit of, as you said, transparency, truth-telling, and reconciliation, one of the things that we think about with data, how do we make things that are unseen seen? And how do we, unless we are able to see, unless we're able to expose, we can't really fix anything. We can't undo the harm. We can't reverse the harm. We can't address it. And I think, I think that was a situation for me that, I had to leave the fellowship early because we went to this location called Serenity. And, it's so funny because I think films like the film Get Out has given us Black, white, Asian, all people of color, a new language to kind of understand how often racism or discrimination can be experienced in built environments. And we went there, and while it was a completely beautiful setting, something within me felt that, okay, this doesn't feel right. We don't necessarily feel safe here. I think that was based on my experience growing up in the South, being on the border of places like the Highlander Center, understanding how even if you're 40 minutes outside of Atlanta, a metropolitan hub, we're in the state of Georgia, right? The state of Georgia that's now being governed by, Governor Brian Kemp, who was Secretary of State before, who led a massive voter suppression project that we're probably going to see the impact of once again in November. So all these different layers. And, as Konstanze, you explained, we had gone to the Civil Rights Museum, and it was powerful to go and experience an installation where we sat at a lunch counter and put on headphones and heard actual audio from those protests, and you hear the violence, or you step into a installation that, where you can see, like, you're in the middle of a protest that happened in the 60s, and there's police dogs and there's rubber bullets. But for me, it was clear that, well, that contrast between that was how racism reared its ugly head in the past, to how does it look today, right? And in a way, even though I had to leave early, unfortunately, I'm so, in a way, grateful for that experience, because there would have been no other way that I would have been able to go to Serenbe. Because once I got home and I did more research, I realized my instincts were right. Serenbe sits in Chattahoochee Hills, which is a completely white area, right next door adjacent to Palmetto, which has a very large African-American and Latino population, but also twice the percentage of people that live in poverty. And Serenbe is part of a trend of how people have used the ideas of wellness, of farm to table, and in a lot of ways colonized those concepts, and have really kind of used it to create this new era of really segregation, right? Serenbe was built because I think, from what it seemed, people, and from what we know, the history of the place, people wanted to leave Atlanta, and not have to pay taxes, and really be away from living next to Black people, Latinx people, poor people, not have to have tax money being used to actually help the city and build up the metropolitan area, but use it for their own systems and own water. And, I think going there, and it's so crazy, it's been exactly 1 year, we're seeing another kind of migration, right? With the COVID-19 pandemic, with the worldwide uprising, especially what's happening in the US here. We hear on the news Donald Trump talking about the suburbs and this new crime order. And, we're seeing a lot of people leaving cities, right? And with them taking resources, and with them, bringing those resources elsewhere. And, it was really powerful, again, reminder for me to see, wow, again, yes, we still have these instances, as we know from the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and other victims of police violence. We still have these very visceral, very clear examples of state violence and racism, but on an everyday basis, this is what it looks like. Sadly, it looks like places like Serenbe, right? It looks like the creation of these communities, and it looks like, and just like technology, right? It's this veil of the new and the novel, and this promise of potential, and this can only be good, but beneath it, under the hood, is a more sordid, kind of complicated, and often sadly violent history.
Yeah. And this is what we're going to be exploring today. And going back to that year ago, as you said, what happened is we weren't trained, to see that. And we weren't trained to see the situation you're in. And when we spoke about that, it's sort of the parallel to your work is sort of, once you see something, you can't unsee that, right? So as you start recognizing and being made aware of your biases or your blind spots and what it is that you were just neglecting, not knowing about, I think one thing is you certainly become more humble, and especially, so I'm still sad you had to leave the fellowship event, not the fellowship, but the fellowship event early because you didn't feel safe, which is especially a blow because that's what the fellowship should be. It should feel safe. It should feel welcome. Everyone should feel welcome and trusted. And it should be a community where you feel listen to, and you can show your whole self. And this is where we failed, and we fell short, and we are so sorry. And what it sparked is, it sparked a process inside Ashoka also. It was our biggest igniting moment, probably, to propel an internal change process. So we launched a DEI task force that is looking at internal practices and structures. Our colleagues are coming together around the world and all 4 continents and groups, all ethnicities, genders, and management levels, to jointly read and explore and talk about racism and biases and how they play out. We are forming an external advisory group that helps us with their expertise. So something I want to say is just some steps, came out of it that we want to be intentional and deliberate about going forward. And of course, work to find and support, truly more fellows who work on dismantling systemic racism and structures that perpetuate inequity. And thank you, Yeshi, for helping us get better, and for also being so bold and courageous, and bringing that up, and and confronting us with that, and for enabling us to move on.
Definitely. And I'm so glad to hear the progress that came out of it. And, I'll go into more of my story. This is something I've just always been doing, right? This is why I started Data for Black Lives, speaking out, being bold and courageous, and I did it because I believe in Ashoka. I believe in the work that we are all doing here as Ashoka Fellows, as Changemakers. I believe in the mission of the organization. And I knew that, again, that none of these issues were isolated to Ashoka or to one team or to one experience, that this is larger and it's systemic, and it's the same kind of conversations we're trying to have with tech companies, right? That we're trying to have with academic institutions, that we're trying to have with other, even nonprofit organizations that are thinking about data, right? So I think that's why I'm so excited that you all took the charge and like really moved on it. And I'm glad that in a lot of ways I helped ignite a many. So that makes me feel good, because I feel like I've received a lot from Ashoka, even though, I wasn't able to stay for the fellowship, and that makes me know that in a way maybe I'm giving back.
You are plentiful. Thank you, Yeshi. Thank you so much. And let's take the time right now to talk more about you and your work. And we've been teasering it on all kinds of levels by talking about the things we see, we don't see, and we'll be talking here specifically about technology, which is how it works, is hidden from our view also. Before we go into that, I would like to ask you, you had moments of epiphany when growing up that I think alerted you to biases, unconscious biases built into our structure. And I wanted to ask you whether you felt comfortable sharing an episode, because I think it might help our audience understand what you were seeing that others might not be seeing.
Yeah. I've had several epiphanies. I always tell the story about my experience in high school, and it's so amazing how we're in a moment now of protests and civil disobedience, because that was a moment for me that made me realize, just how apparent and how obvious unconscious bias is, but also how harmful it can be when it's unchecked. And, when I was in high school, some young people at a neighboring school, I went to, middle school, then elementary school, but I was in a different program. They had organized a peaceful protest in response to a student being put in a chokehold, actually by a vice principal. So this was 2007, 2008, before we had like more high-tech quality video cameras. We had grainy phone footage. But these young people, they said, they passed out flyers. They said, we're gonna, this enough is enough. We're so tired of this happening in our high schools. I know I went to school. I was a part of the International Baccalaureate program, but in my school at large, it was very normal to be suspended, literally sent home for not having a school ID, or you're a little bit late to school, you're locked out of your first period class. And for somebody who was like a total nerd and I hated missing class, that was very damaging, right? And school was a place where I, went to because I had so much going on at home, being, raised by a single immigrant mother. And that was a refuge for me. And so if I didn't feel safe there, where did I feel safe? But I also, through the experience, said, okay, wow, like, having to fight for my education helped me actually be even more committed to it. But when this situation happened with the young people, they organized this peaceful protest instead of the school district, the city, everyone else kind of recognizing them as, civic leaders, doing a nonviolent protest, coming together, using nonviolent tactics. They actually sent in SWAT teams, police cars, police dogs. I will never forget being at home and watching on national news, CNN and local news, students riot at Miami Edison Senior High, right? Very similar to what's happening now. It was not a riot, it was a peaceful protest, but it was obviously interpreted as a riot just because of who was leading it, right? In this case, it was predominantly young Black students who are from an immigrant background, poor students. And, I knew at that moment that we weren't just kind of battling, the school security or the administration or the police. We were battling these myths and these ideas and these narratives that had been perpetuated historically for a very long time. One example is the super predator myth, right? We're seeing a lot of some of the same rhetoric being arising right now in the national conversation around law and order, right? Yeah. But on a, that's what we were battling, right? How these actual myths and ideas became translated into policy, became translated into practices, how they become translated into data, and how on a very real level, they were, really violent and really used as the weapons of violence. So, for me, I knew then that yes, protest was an amazing and powerful way for us to get our voices heard, but what else could we do? And that's when we got, I joined an organization, Power Center for Social Change, and we hit the ground running, surveying over 600 young people about their experiences with suspensions and arrests and police brutality in schools. And we turned all that data into a comic book. And, it was really important to collect that body of data because so much of the existing data, if it was being collected in schools, was very biased. It wasn't reflecting real experiences. And B, it was so helpful for us to not just in Miami push back and fight for policies like restorative justice, but even to this day, I still hear of people who were youth organizers back then in cities like Knoxville, in Oakland, in Denver, who used the comic book, and that just propelled me on this kind of wave of wow, data, yes, we live in a world where historically data has been weaponized against Black communities, but in the right hands, data can be such a powerful tool to speak for people who usually don't have a voice, right? And, after that happened, I went on to college and I said, I'm going to focus on getting as much skills in data collection, data analysis, interpretation, dissemination, research that I possibly could. And I brought those skills back to Miami, and I went to work on a campaign about something totally different at the same organization, but around Black infant mortality and what was happening in the hospitals. And at that time, Black babies were 3 times more likely to die before their first birthday for a whole host of different reasons. There wasn't a lot of consensus on the national and research level about why that was happening. But, folks in the community knew that it was because of specific hospital practices, the overuse of C-section rates, right? The aggressive marketing of infant formula and discouragement of breastfeeding, and just this overall environment that really didn't, value Black babies, Black mothers, Black families, Black life, poor people. So, it was another situation where we knew what needed to change, but we've had a lot of resistance from leadership. And it took us surveying over 300 moms, asking them about their experiences in hospitals, and then using that data to write a research report where we put out some concrete policy recommendations. And it was really powerful, right? Because even though we knew, that the hospital leadership, we knew that even it became clear to me talking about, infant formula was way more political than I thought it would ever be. But exactly what you said, I think that through that data, we were able to speak the language of the hospital leadership in a way that wasn't possible before, right? And we were able to expose to such a broader audience what most people didn't see or experience, right? Yeah. Most people, I wasn't a parent. It took me doing data collection to even understand. I had no idea what was happening in the hospitals with giving birth, and certainly for others in the community, and even people at the hospital's leadership level themselves, right? To really see these are the experiences of people who are coming into the public hospital, who are, going to give birth, and this is what's happening. And I think, on the one hand, those two experiences from these epiphany moments, on the one hand, it's true, yes, data and technology does have this power to obfuscate, to hide biases, to conceal, and even to deceive, but at the same time, right, depending on whose hands it's in, depending on how it's used, depending on the kind of questions we ask, who we ask the questions to, it can be a really powerful tool to reveal what's not working, what's harmful, and what needs to be done. And I'm happy to say that we won that campaign. The hospital totally revitalized its entire maternal and child health ward, brought in a whole new team from all over the country. And, obviously their policy implementation, that's a long process, but it's been amazing to see how that sent this ripple wave, that showed that no, like, we take this issue of Black infant mortality seriously. And most importantly, for me, the win in that meeting was hearing them say, before we implement any new policy, we're going to talk to women, mothers in the community first.
Yeah. This is it's amazing, because in a nutshell, there's so many elements of your work that you are doing nowadays that were already contained therein, right? The sort of the recognition that data can be both a sort of means of oppression, right, and a tool for liberation, and the question about, like, how are we gathering data? Who are we listening to? How are we interpreting it? How are we understanding it? And I wanted to ask you about that in the context of what is happening nowadays, and where specific danger, I assume, is that algorithms can take biases and just run with them, right? They just accelerate and escalate them at an enormous level. So it becomes really important to look at the assumption and the data that you are using to build the algorithms in the first place. And Yeshi, you are an expert for sort of detecting these flaws and working on correcting them by working with organizers, communities, data scientists, academic institutions, tech centers. And I was wondering whether you could pick an example and walk us through, for instance, we were talking about credit history the other day, how that, how it comes, how the biases come about, and
yes,
what do you do in terms of addressing it?
That's a great question. I have been obsessed with credit scoring and FICO scores for a very long time. And, to be transparent, from my own personal history, I know people, I've had experiences in my own family where we've been denied housing. Hardworking families are on the streets because of a 3-digit number, right?
Yeah.
Credit scores are so powerful. I have conversations with some Silicon Valley fintech people who say, no, credit scoring is not that powerful, but that's the bias, right? If you're wealthy, you have a really good job, you're not going to have a problem finding a home. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck and you live in a community like New York or, wherever, where it can become a very big barrier. And, I think credit scoring in a vacuum, it's a good idea, right? It's so funny. Like, the history around FICO credit scores, Fair and Isaac Company, they're a private company, they're not a federal agency, is a typical kind of startup Silicon Valley story where a mathematician and an engineer came together in the 1950s, 60s, and said, we want to use machine learning, right, to really kind of better approach this problem of risk and creditworthiness and lending. The whole idea was to actually make credit more accessible to people, and not to rely on just human discretion and human judgment when deciding who gets a loan and who doesn't get a loan.
So it was well-intentioned in a way.
It was very well-intentioned. And I think this is a flaw too, where people think, okay, by us bringing in a model or a technology, we're going to address human flaws. No, right? These technologies are made by humans, so they only reproduce them, right? And that's what we've been able to see with credit scoring, right? Unfortunately, FICO credit scores, they're a proprietary algorithm. We can't get under the hood, as we like to say in Native for Black Lives, to really understand the model and piece apart what they use. But we can kind of get a sense of, based on what they tell us and based on the real outcomes of who has high credit scores and who doesn't, and who generally has credit access. part of like, part of your score, for example, is made up of like, I think 30% credit history. And, one of the ways in which, there's a few ways in which, the credit scoring model is flawed, right? I think when you think about it historically, first of all, even though FICO, they say that they don't use zip code or any other variables for race in their model, again, we don't know that. And I mean, especially with the example around zip code, right? Whether it's zip code or whether it's some other proxy for address or where you live, in the context of American history and US history, redlining, segregation, so much restrictive covenants that prevented some people from living in some neighborhoods and others from, not being able to move into certain neighborhoods, that has literally built some of the cities and segregation that we talked about earlier with this example in Atlanta. That has become a #1 predictor for race. And there's so much data that shows that huge differences in people's credit scores based on where they live, even when you control for income and the amount of debt, right? Which are two other indicators of credit worthiness. And another thing, I mean, when you think about it, having something like, your credit history, if your parent made you an authorized user on your credit card, on their credit card, you're automatically going to have a longer credit history. And, traditionally, especially for Black communities that have been barred to access to credit and capital, that can only perpetuate these kind of generational divides that we're seeing now, where, folks are actually so much more worse off than their parents and their parents' parents, right? Yeah. So, in terms of what do we do, right? I think for us, it's really, we're seeing a lot of movement on the federal level around bringing more accountability into credit scoring models. I mean, literally, I was listening on a FICO shareholder meeting, and the fact that they made 183% more like over their profit margins during the pandemic shows how built into their business model is, the fact that people will, especially during this time, miss payments. They literally profit off of people's inability, right, to be able to like meet the requirements to have a high credit score. I think while we're pushing for kind of working with folks from Maxine Waters' office, doing federal legislation, trying to hold the Consumer Protection Financial Bureau accountable to their mission statement, I think on the other end, there's a lot more that we can do, right? And I see a lot of kind of innovation, a lot of opportunity in the area of financial tech, fintech, to be able to do that. And on the last call, we talked about how some of the things that we've been thinking about internally is rethinking mortgage underwriting algorithms, right? We see that fintech algorithms have a 30% less likelihood of discriminating, right, than traditional lending sources. And I think in a time like now where Black communities so many studies have showed that, for example, Black business owners are like 5 times less likely to be offered, much less approved for a paycheck protection loan and things like that. Like we're gonna need, like the urgent need for, different solutions and different alternatives while we're doing this work of like larger accountability is going to become even more important. So, I think it's an ongoing thing. I think for us, we're even thinking bigger picture, right? How do we rethink the entire credit system? Securitization, the financialization of the economy. We're still reeling from the 2008 crisis, which was largely a credit crisis, right? There's so much in the data science field, right? Where I personally know people who left hedge funds because of the work that they did during that time. They heavily recruited mathematicians. They heavily recruited data scientists and really smart quantitative people to be a part of this process of creating these complex financial models that, again, rig the system to make some people very wealthy at the expense of literally entire pension funds and actually, foreclosed on so many people's homes. So it's a big question, right? But I think that's a systemic level. There's an intermediate level. There's all these different ways out that we can approach the problem. And for us, that's been our strategy. We have to approach it from all different directions.
Yeah. And the interesting part is you have to sort of put yourself out of the box, right? To be able to see it, because inside there's always an internal logic to it, which makes, A follow B follow C, etc. And you can't really escape, right? And I was wondering, we are going slightly, I'd like to go over time here, and I hope many people can stay with us. I wanted to ask whether you see any kind of change in behavior from companies or let's say from individuals and companies that make you more hopeful in terms of the work you're doing.
I'm always very hopeful. And I think that it's been awesome to see, a lot of companies have come forth and put out statements. And I think some companies probably did it because it was the right thing to do in terms of optics. But our approach at Data for Black Lives have always been finding the people within these companies who are super committed, who are willing to put their skin in the game, and who really, really want to see change. And I think that's even part of our organizing model, right? I mean, working with companies like Google from the very beginning, right? Google is a machine. It's a huge national, global, multinational organization, but we were able to really identify some amazing people in different departments, their AI department, in some of their creative departments, to really kind of like work with them and to sit down and to think, look, this is the reality of Google's history. This is the reality of what's happening in the present, but what is possible for us to do? And I think I'm excited to see how some of the responses and reactions that the protest brought out does translate into this like long haul, real, like rolling up our sleeves in the trenches kind of work. And I'm already seeing that, right? So I'm really excited. And I'm also excited to see we've gotten an influx of so many different tech workers, folks who work in different industry, organizations, companies who are coming forward to be volunteers, to spend their time to support us and our partners on different projects. So that's been awesome too. So yeah, I'm optimistic. I think as we talked about in the beginning, this moment, whether it was the COVID-19 pandemic or the uprisings, have really been a moment of reckoning and also revealing. But now it's really up to us, right, to turn some of the pain and some of the rawness of this moment and really turn it into purpose and long-term change. So that's what I'm excited for.
Well, that's it's great that you're seeing optimism and positive signs amidst all of this chaos. And I wanted to ask you, you mentioned COVID-19 a couple of times. So what we are seeing there is also a heavy bias coming out in how we talk about it and how we treat people, what kind of treatment we allot to whom, where again, Black people are, neglected and marginalized. Yes. And that is also something you've been focusing on with Data for Black Lives a lot.
Yes. So, I mean, immediately when I started to read the headlines about, this is in early April, about the disproportionate impact on Black communities, I started to go directly to the data. I literally, we went on every single state's open data portal just to see what kind of data they were reporting, whether they were reporting on race, and what was the kind of, quality of that data. And when we first launched this aggregated data set where we listed all of the states, maybe about less than like 11 states were reporting by race, within a month over every single state was reporting by race. But there was still these big discrepancies around, on average, every state, over half of their data on deaths and cases, race was unknown. So still, right, we knew the reality of the data. We knew the reality of talking to folks in our network, hearing personally and just abroad about how people were being impacted. But we also saw these headlines, and that goes back to the narratives, and it goes back to what's seen and unseen, where it was in a lot of ways blaming Black communities, this pathologizing narrative that had very little focus on what were the structural, systemic, and deeply entrenched reasons why COVID-19 would impact Black communities in this way. And that's why, in addition to doing the data tracking, and right now we're building a tool that we're debuting actually next week. We use Python to code a tool that automatically scrapes the data from every single open data website per state and is going to help us analyze in real time the impact on Black communities. But while we're doing that, we also brought together organizers, activists, public health professionals to talk about why this was happening, but also how do we coordinate, mobilize, and how do we respond in this moment? And, you know, for me, that was a powerful roundtable we held, but it's been a really powerful moment as more people, you know, are really kind of learning about like what's happening in these hospitals. Like what I described with my experience is an example, right?
Yeah.
You know, today ProPublica put out an article about how at a New Orleans hospital, what was happening there. I think a lot of people just didn't know, right? Unless you live in a very poor community, underserved, neglected community, Black community, unless you have to go to a public hospital because you have no insurance, county hospital, you're not going to know what's happening. You're not going to see the overwhelmed, you know, ER physicians and nurses. You're not going to see the lack of beds. You're not going to see that, right? You don't know. And I think that was a part of it too, right? So, you know, we're going to continue to kind of track this because the next phase, obviously COVID is not over. People are still sadly perishing from the virus, but as every city kind of steps into recovery, it's going to be important for us to continue working with chief data officers, local officials, to think about how are we bringing in other forms of data, you know, not just the kind of very, not flawed, but data that has like data that's been collected that is really missing the bigger picture, right?
Yeah.
How do we use data? How do we collect quantitative and qualitative data that paints a bigger picture and that helps us, again, see what a lot of us aren't able to see unless we're directly impacted by these issues.
Yeah, yeah. And stuff like that, you know, algorithms are biased towards, you know, proxies that are taken from white people, you know, sort of that take, like, say, spending on healthcare as an indicator for how healthy you are. And guess what? You know, poor people, and, you know, often by race fall through, right? Because they're
Yeah, so what you're touching on, that was the United Health algorithm. Correct. Where, they were using variables such as spending, how much a patient spent to determine their risk level in terms of chronic illness. And that risk level, risk score was being used to determine who got attention first, who got surgery first. And sadly, because of that algorithm, so many Black patients in particular fell to the wayside and even died, because we know that a lot of Black people don't have insurance, right? Who has the resources based on the racial wealth gap and based on other factors in this country to spend a lot on healthcare. So that's a very good example of how, you know, we have to be careful in what we're putting into the picture, but also, as I said on one of our other panels, you know, we have to ask ourselves, what are we optimizing, right? Are we optimizing profit? Are we optimizing getting the most, you know, vulnerable and at risk people healthcare and services the fastest? What are we optimizing? And that's a data science question that I think is also like a like life and everyday question too, right? Yeah. That I think people should really reflect on. And sadly, a lot of people don't. And that kind of influences outcomes.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeshi, I could go on and listen to you the whole day, but we are already over time that we booked from you. So I want to finish here with a question in the chat. Sort of someone's asking, how can individuals inquire about working with your organization? Do you want to say a few words and perhaps also mention how to follow you on Twitter or other social media to keep up?
Certainly. You can follow me at Yes She Can, but follow our Data for Black Lives Twitter, data number 4 Black Lives, and reach out to us on d4bl.org. You know, on our site, there's ways for you to volunteer. There's ways for you to stay in touch via email. I write out, you know, like quarterly newsletters, reflections and pieces and thoughts that I send out to our network. And also you can join our network to be a member. And that's a different level of engagement where a lot of people are starting local and regional hubs. If you want to join a hub, let us know, reach out to us. We have hubs in Atlanta, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Toronto, DMV area, and we have a waiting list of over 50 hubs. So we'll be in touch about other cities as they open up. So there's a lot of ways to be involved and get connected, but please, we welcome you. Everyone is invited, and we welcome everyone to be a part of our movement.
Thank you so much, Yeshi. Thank you everyone for listening in for this fascinating conversation. And yeah, we will, I hope everyone takes with that so we're trying to be aware of what we're not seeing in order to learn how to see better. And thank you for helping us and illuminating us on the way, Yeshi. Thank you. Have a good day, everyone, and be in touch. Bye.